Where I'm from, you see a lot of inequality. The bustling and bustling financial centers of the north and tourism centers of the north. And in a lot of parts of the south, you have high levels of poverty where people probably don't have access to basic services or proper infrastructure or proper meals on a daily basis. Also, in the slums of the city, it's a serious problem to deal with.
And where I'm from, poverty is a serious issue in terms of it's caused by not only the uneven distribution of resources, but also high corruption levels that has trickled down into different parts of our country and has severely affected the living conditions.
Where I'm from, there's a lot of poverty. I grew up seeing basically my own neighbors not being able to sustain their family, not being able to have a proper meal, not knowing where their next meal is going to come from, suffering real absolute poverty.
Poverty can be absolute or relative, and in Trinidad, I find that it's more relative than absolute because there's the uneven distribution of income and wealth in this country, and it's so unfortunate that some persons are at the lower end of the income chain.
And in Trinidad, you could definitely see there's a problem where you have poor and rich living next to each other, and I would say within my community, I do acknowledge that there are people under the poverty line.
I believe that in Trinidad we also suffer from something called the dependency syndrome, and that in a sense it contributes to poverty levels because some persons, instead of aspiring to do better or to want better, they somewhere in their minds they believe that the government will just provide and alleviate poverty for them because that's their responsibility and not so much an individual responsibility.
So you need to find a good balance. Because you need to incent people to work harder, but you don't make them work too hard and then they get taxed everything. Like, oh, let me work a little bit less.
Yeah.
So we need to be careful how we tweak the system in tackling poverty.
That would mean that every country would sort of have to accept a sort of baseline level of poverty.
Well, we do have that. The UN actually has, absolute poverty line, which is, under $2 US a day, whatnot. So we have an international benchmark, but in each country, they have their own relative poverty,
right,
quantity of standard of living. I believe hunger is the worst symptom of poverty you can feel. In terms that, you go home, you go to bed hungry, that's the thing on your mind, food.
I totally agree. For one, there's a reason why hunger eradication is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's actually quite up there. And also, hunger can result in death. Like, if you don't have a home or you don't have clothes, you will not die. But it's one of the symptoms of poverty that can actually kill.
I believe that hunger is a very bad symptom of poverty. However, I would also like to look at the other symptoms of poverty, like lack of shelter. I do think that something like lack of shelter can mess with your mind as well. It can mess with you psychologically, and those kind of things, it could lead to depression, which can also lead to death.
I agree because, first of all, we have to remember that in Trinidad and Tobago, we still rely heavily on imported goods, for example, especially in agriculture. Even though we have a small agricultural sector, we still import a lot of our major foods. And most of the immigrants coming to the country, they actually come to purchase these foods to take back to their country. So,
and I would agree, but not only in terms of food, but more in services that the government provide in terms of public health, and that a lot of them will come to the hospitals and that they are not citizens, they're not paying taxes. I'm not saying that they have to pay taxes because they're not regularized, of course.
Yeah.
If we don't address the issue properly and we don't have public spending allocated properly, it will cause problems with different sectors and definitely it will have ripple effects on the rest of the economy.
I don't find there has been a concerted effort to deal with the issue and put institutions in place. So it's what we had before that we have to see how it's running now based on the current situation. Then we can say, okay, the resources are strained. are we seeing immigrants on the streets homeless? And I don't see that. I think it's not a crisis as yet.
I don't think that it is so much like of an influx to say that our resources have been strained to that extent where, as my colleague said, we have people outside in long lines. And even if we do have a strain on the health sector, we have so many health centers and facilities.
So if you really look at it, we don't grow the majority of our food. So if it is, we are constantly importing food and Venezuelans are constantly coming in, then eventually it would be an issue in the future, because it's not only the 60,000 that is here right now, it's also the ones that just trade on the borderlines.
Well, climate change is real. It's an issue that's upon us, and sea levels are rising, it is getting warmer, disasters are on the way. And in the current state of the market, where governments have not taken a concerted effort to try to make mitigation resources and green energy resources available to not just poor countries, but poor people within those countries is a problem, and it does impact the poor and the rich.
I agree with you, and if you were to look at it in the sense of poor countries and periphery, the periphery suffers the most because, first of all, the majority of us who live in the Caribbean, we are surrounded by water.
Last time Dominica was devastated by the hurricane, the government there is trying to hurricane-proof the island, and that's a very good, noble initiative, but we know Dominica is not the richest island in the Caribbean. And, how could they afford to do something like that? Put all the electric lines on the ground and put measures in place to make it sustainable.
And then also to the economies of most small developing islands, especially the Caribbean, is based on agriculture. And agriculture is so fragile to certain things like droughts, hurricanes, all these things. They devastate the agricultural sector. And farmers, most of us, when we have no crop, there's no way we can sustain our families themselves. And in extension, we have no crops to go sell, thus increasing hunger levels. And the poor person really does suffer in the end.
People that are poor might not be able to, my colleague mentioned it a little bit. I would say it definitely affects poor people more than rich people, because rich people have the ability to
Adapt.
Yeah.
And access to resources more quicker.
I agree.
Hi, I'd like to thank our participants for getting the discussion started. And I'd like to invite you to our Youth Economic Forum on the 28th of March at 1 p.m. at the FSS Lounge.